The mountain kills with height, and the desert with distance, and the cave and the mine by swallowing a person straight down into the dark. The swamp does none of those things. It has no height, no horizon, and almost no down. It is a country laid flat, an inch of water over a bottomless softness, stretching to every side in a maze of black channels and drowned trees that all look exactly the same. And that is its whole terrible trick. You do not fall in a swamp. You do not run out of water in a swamp. You simply lose the direction of the way out. And the swamp, unlike any other wilderness, does not give it back. There is no solid ground to stand on and think. The footing is muck that grips a boot and then a leg. The water hides the holes and the roots and the drop-offs. The cypress and the sawgrass close the sightlines to a few dozen feet in every direction, so that a person a quarter mile from a road can turn in a slow circle and see nothing but the same green-black tangle repeating to the edge of the world. People do not vanish in a swamp because they went too far. They vanish because they took 3 wrong steps, and every step after that was a guess, and the swamp has 1,000 ways to make a guess fatal. The cold of the water, the exhaustion of the muck, the current of a channel, and the quiet, patient way that still black water closes over a thing and does not mark the spot. This is a countdown of 10 American swamps that took people in and did not give them back, 10 real wetlands, and 10 real people the black water kept. Some were lost in the maze and never walked out. Some went under and were never found. And one lay in a tent in a flooded prairie for years, as a mystery the whole country could not solve. The through line is not the wild reclaiming its own. It is that a swamp does not hide a person the way other country does. It dissolves them. We begin at the very end of the road. In the far south of Florida, past the last of the towns and the strip malls and the orange groves, State Road 9336 runs down through Everglades National Park until it simply stops at a place called Flamingo on the shore of Florida Bay, where the North American continent frays apart into water. There is a visitor center there, and a marina, and a campground. There are manatees in the boat basin and crocodiles on the banks. It is the developed heart of the southern Everglades, about as far from trackless wilderness as the park gets, and that is exactly why it is the right place to begin, because the first thing you have to understand about a swamp is that it does not need the deep backcountry to take you. It can do it in the parking lot. The country around Flamingo is coastal prairie and mangrove and sawgrass, a flat, hot, low expanse where the land does not so much end as dissolve, giving way by degrees to marsh and then to open water. From a car it looks benign, even dull. A green horizon, a heat shimmer, a few wading birds. But step off the pavement and the ground turns soft and then wet. The sawgrass rises to head height and closes behind you. The sightlines collapse to a few dozen feet of identical green in every direction. There is no rise to climb for a view because there are no rises. There is no landmark to steer by, because every acre looks like the last. A person a few hundred yards off the road in that flat green maze is as lost as a person 100 miles into a forest, and far harder to find because the swamp holds no track. The muck closes over a footprint. The water carries away a scent. The sawgrass springs back upright behind a body as if nothing had passed. In March of 2011, a 67-year-old man named Roger Sawyer was at Flamingo with his family. He was a retired butcher, and he was, by every account, exactly the kind of person you would least expect this to happen to. Not a frail man, not a confused one, not a stranger to the outdoors. He was an experienced outdoorsman in a developed part of a national park, with his family a short distance away. There was nothing about the day that should have been dangerous. The group split up for a little while, the way families do, and Roger Sawyer said he was going to step away to stretch his legs. That is the whole of it. That is the entire event. He walked a short distance away from the motorhome to stretch his legs in daylight near the developed core of the park, and within roughly 20 minutes, he was gone. Not overdue, not lost on a long hike. Gone, as though the flat green ground had opened and closed. When he did not come back, the response was fast, and it was large, because everyone understood what the Everglades could do. Over the following days, the search for Roger Sawyer grew into a major multi-agency effort. Ground teams wading the sawgrass and the coastal prairie, aircraft quartering the marsh from above, K9 units brought in to work whatever scent the wet ground still held. They searched the mangrove and the prairie and the endless flat country around Flamingo the way you search when the missing person should be close, because everything about the case said he should have been close. He had told his family he was staying near. He was not equipped for a long journey. He had gone to stretch his legs. They found nothing, not a piece of clothing, not a footprint they could follow past the place he had last stood. Not a single trace. In roughly 10 days of searching by air and by ground and by dog, of a 67-year-old man who had walked a few hundred yards from his family and vanished into flat, open, sunlit country. The search wound down. The case, as this film is made, is still open, and Roger Sawyer has never been found. Sit with the shape of that, because it is the shape of every case still to come. We tell ourselves a story about how people disappear in the wild, that they go too deep, or too far, or too unprepared, that vanishing is the price of a mistake, and that the careful and the near are safe. Flamingo says otherwise. It says the swamp does not require a great distance or a foolish error. It requires only that you step a little way into it, a few hundred yards, 20 minutes, a stretch of the legs. Because the moment the sawgrass closes behind you, you are in a country with no direction and no landmark and no memory of your passing, and the flat green maze that looks so harmless from the road is, in its quiet way, one of the most efficient devices for erasing a human being that exists anywhere in the United States. That is why we start here, in the developed heart of the park, and not in some remote corner of the backcountry. Because if the Everglades can take a capable man in 20 minutes, in sight of the marina, then what follows? The deeper swamps, the black bayous, the airliners that fell out of the sky into the muck, is not a collection of freak events. It is the swamp being exactly what it is, a wilderness that does not hide people by distance or by depth, but by dissolving the very difference between one direction and every other, and then closing over them like still water and not marking the spot. 20 minutes, a few hundred yards from his family's motorhome, and Roger Sawyer stepped into the sawgrass and out of the world. No track, no trace, nothing for the dogs to follow past the spot where he'd stood. The Everglades can do that in the time it takes to stretch your legs. And it is not even the only kind of water in the south that swallows people whole. The next swamp took a man off a boat, in open water, in front of a witness. The little Atchafalaya in that stretch near Butte La Rose is less a river and more a moving vein of the swamp's circulatory system. It is defined by its unpredictability, a channel where the water level fluctuates with the temper of the Mississippi and the hydraulic demands of the floodgates, creating a landscape of submerged obstacles that shift with every rising tide. The silt here is not merely dirt. It is a fine, suffocating suspension that turns the water into an opaque ochre slurry. When the vessel collided with that other craft, the force was enough to shatter the immediate routine of the afternoon, turning a quiet transit into a desperate struggle against a medium that refused to offer any purchase. The impact sent a shock wave through the water, but the river absorbed the sound and the displacement with a chilling, fluid indifference. The search efforts were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer, chaotic anatomy of the basin. Divers who descended into the gloom described a sensory erasure. Once they sank below the surface, they were working in a vacuum where artificial light scattered against the suspended sediment, creating a blinding golden fog. They had to navigate by touch alone, feeling their way through a submerged forest of jagged cypress knees and the rusted skeletal remains of old timber pilings that littered the riverbed. Every sweep of their arms risked snagging on debris or being pinned by the relentless, invisible current that pushed hard against their gear. The scale of the search was immense, involving multiple agencies, cadaver-sniffing dogs on flat-bottomed skiffs, and side-scan sonar that rendered the river floor as a series of incomprehensible, jagged humps and hollows. Yet, for all the advanced technology deployed, the basin functioned as an expert concealer. The river's hydraulic pressure was such that it could carry a body through the tangle of the root systems, wedging it into pockets of the bank or burying it beneath layers of shifting mud that compacted almost immediately. Searchers spoke of the frustration of scanning the same 50-yard radius for hours, knowing the target was within reach, yet completely shielded by the fluid, shifting architecture of the swamp. It was a process of slow, agonizing attrition. The heat of the Louisiana May began to set in, turning the surface of the bayou into a steaming, airless expanse, while the search teams moved in a state of grim, repetitive exhaustion. They were not just fighting the river. They were fighting the fact that in the Atchafalaya, the bottom is not a fixed surface, but a dynamic, hungry space that swallows evidence as easily as it swallows light. The Atchafalaya Basin is not a place you visit. It is a place you enter, and once you are inside, you are subject to a geography that defies the map. Located in south-central Louisiana, it is the largest river swamp in the United States, a sprawling million-acre labyrinth where the Mississippi River spills its strength into a low-lying basin of bayous, cypress tupelo forests, and open, dark water. It is a world of constant motion and deep sediment-heavy silence. To move through the Atchafalaya is to navigate a shifting architecture of water. The channels are not static. They braid and loop, carving through the mud in a slow-motion dance that changes with the season and the height of the river. It is a grand, wet wilderness that offers no horizon to navigate by and no dry ground to retreat to. For those who live along its edges, the basin is a way of life. But for those who underestimate the speed at which this water can claim a life, it is a place that functions like a trap. The danger of the Atchafalaya is not in its scale, though it is vast enough to hide a city, but in its character. This is water that is rarely clear and almost never still. Beneath the surface of the bayous and the open lakes, the current is deceptive, pulling at anything that loses its purchase. The roots of the bald cypress trees reach out like fingers in the silt, and the heavy tea-colored water masks depths and obstructions that can entangle a person in an instant. It is a place where the difference between being on the water and being beneath it is often measured in seconds, and where the water itself is so thick with tannins and silt that light barely penetrates more than a few inches down. If you fall in, the swamp does not merely get you wet, it wraps itself around you, pulling you into a cold, dark, and featureless space where you are effectively erased from the visual world the moment you submerge. On the 29th of April in 2021, a man named Robert Schoeffler set out onto the Little Atchafalaya River near the town of Butte-la-Rose. He was 81 years old, a man who had spent enough time around the water to know the rhythm of the basin, yet he was about to experience the absolute unforgiving finality of it. He was out in a boat, a common enough activity for the residents of the basin, when a collision occurred on the water. It was a sudden, chaotic event, the kind of accident that can happen in a heartbeat on the narrow, winding channels of the river. The impact threw Schoeffler from the vessel and into the dark, churning water of the basin. There were no life jackets on board, and in the shock of the collision, the reality of the environment took over. A passenger who had been in the boat with him managed to cling to the craft or reach the safety of a nearby bank, but Robert Schoeffler did not. He went under. It was not a long, drawn-out struggle in the distance. It happened right there in the presence of a witness, on a day that began with a routine outing. One moment he was visible, and the next, the surface of the Little Atchafalaya was unbroken. The current, strong and heavy with the spring runoff, did exactly what the basin is designed to do. It took hold of him and drew him down into the dark, silt-laden depths where visibility drops to near zero. The search that followed was a testament to the sheer difficulty of finding anyone in the Atchafalaya. Local wildlife officers and search and rescue teams descended on the area, using sonar, dragging equipment, and small boats to grid the river and the surrounding floodplains. They knew exactly where he had gone in, yet the water was a vast, moving shroud. For 8 days the basin guarded its secret. The searchers worked under the heavy, humid heat of a Louisiana spring, navigating the same currents that had claimed the victim, dealing with the same tangle of submerged wood and soft, shifting silt. It was not until the 7th of May, over a week after the collision, that the swamp finally released him. The recovery of Robert Schoeffler was not a victory of discovery, but a grim acknowledgement of the basin's patience. 8 days in the water is an eternity in the search for a missing person, a period that highlights the terrifying efficiency with which this wetland keeps what it takes. The Atchafalaya is a recurring stage for these disappearances, where boaters and paddlers, often experienced, find themselves outmatched by the sheer volume and weight of the river. It is a place that does not provide second chances. When the water takes you, it does not leave you on the surface for long, and it does not offer up its secrets to those who come looking for them. The case of Robert Schoeffler is a stark reminder that in the swamp, you are never more than a few feet away from an abyss that cannot be measured. The water is a barrier, a physical wall that separates the living from the lost, and it operates with a cold, mechanical indifference. It does not care for the age of the person, nor for the fact that there were people nearby who saw the accident happen. The swamp simply does its work. It takes the weight, it holds the body, and it makes the search a long, grueling, and often fruitless exercise in patience. There was a witness 10 feet away, and it made no difference. Robert Schoeffler went under the Atchafalaya, and the Basin held him for 8 days before it let him be found. Black water does not need distance or solitude to take a person. Sometimes it does not even need an adult. The next swamp took a 4-year-old boy on a boardwalk outing in the time it takes to look away. To step into the Barataria Preserve, located just south of New Orleans within the Jean Lafitte National Historical Park, is to enter a world that feels curated for the human eye. It is a landscape of profound, ancient beauty, where the heavy boughs of bold cypress and tupelo trees drape in curtains of Spanish moss over dark, still water. It is a place of boardwalks and interpretive trails designed to bring the visitor into the heart of the Louisiana swamp without requiring them to become part of it. The preserve is a vital link to the historic character of the Mississippi River Delta, a place where the water is slow, the humidity is a constant physical weight, and the life of the bayou is visible just beneath the surface of the black tea-colored channels. It is a place that feels managed, safe, and open to the public, a quiet sanctuary where families go to see the wild edge of their own state. Yet, the existence of a boardwalk, or any structure built to separate a human from the swamp, is a testament to the fact that the ground itself is not meant to be walked upon. The water beneath those boards is the same water that defines the surrounding basin, a system of canals and marshland that stretches in a continuous, unforgiving web across the southern landscape. In July of 2021, the Barataria Preserve was the site of a profound tragedy that shifted the way visitors view the safety of its elevated paths. A young child, 4-year-old Ellis Bourdain, was visiting the preserve with his family on an outing to the Twin Canals area. It was, by all accounts, a routine afternoon spent in one of the more accessible sections of the park, a place where the infrastructure is maintained to ensure that the swamp remains a viewing experience rather than a physical encounter. In a moment that passed in the span of a single breath, the boy fell from the area into the water of the canal. The events that followed were the result of an immediate and desperate effort to reverse the impossible, as the family and bystanders moved to retrieve him from the water. But the swamp, in its silent, deep, and murky way, did not return what had been taken. The search that ensued was comprehensive and immediate, drawing upon the specialized resources of local law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and the personnel of the national park itself. Divers were deployed into the dark, silt-heavy waters of the canal. K-9 units were brought in to track any trace along the banks. Sonar equipment was used to map the floor of the channel, which is constantly shifting with the movement of the bayou's own slow current. For those who watch the search from the shore, the process is one of agonizing, slow precision. The teams worked through the heat and the thick, suffocating undergrowth, checking every root system and every submerged obstacle, navigating the same water that had, only moments before, been a backdrop for a family day. Despite the scale of the operation and the intensity of the search, the effort eventually transitioned from a rescue to a recovery, leaving a family to face a loss that remains as quiet and enduring as the swamp itself. To look at the Barataria now is to see the same tranquil, green-filtered light and to hear the same stillness of the cypress forest. But the tragedy of that day serves as a stark reminder of the boundary between the tourist and the wilderness. The swamp does not care for the age of the person, nor does it respect the safety of a designated walking path. It is a hydraulic system that operates by its own logic, indifferent to the structures we place over it. When a person enters that water, they are not merely stepping into a pond or a lake. They are entering a vast interconnected network where the current is often hidden, The bottom is a shifting layer of organic decay, and the visibility is reduced to near zero the moment one goes beneath the surface. The search for the boy was an attempt to impose human order upon a place that has no interest in being understood or managed. It underscored the fragility of our presence in these wet southern lands, where a single, instantaneous accident can erase a life and leave the water as still and undisturbed as if nothing had ever happened. The tragedy in the Twin Canals area was not a matter of getting lost in the deep backcountry or failing to navigate a trail. It was a matter of proximity. It proved that the swamp is not a distant, hostile frontier that must be sought out. It is a presence that exists right at our feet, separated from our daily lives by nothing more than a wooden rail or a few inches of elevation. We build these paths to keep the wild at a distance, to frame it and to enjoy it, but the swamp remains entirely, stubbornly present. It is a reminder that in the low-lying heart of the South, the line between solid, safe ground and the hungry, swallowing dark of the wetlands is thinner than we are willing to admit. It is a place that does not need a storm or a disaster to be dangerous. It needs only a momentary lack of physical contact with the world we have constructed. A boardwalk, a family afternoon, an inch of black water below the boards, and the Barataria took a 4-year-old in the time it takes to turn your head. The swamp does not require the deep wild, or a wrong turn, or even an adult, and it does not measure its dead one at a time. The next swamp took 101 people out of the sky in a single evening, and gave most of them back to no one. The rescue effort that followed was less a mission than an excavation of a nightmare. The site of the impact, located some 18 miles west of Miami International Airport, existed in a zone of the Everglades known for its particularly treacherous hydrology. It was a region of flooded prairies and dense sawgrass hummocks where the water, seldom more than 2 feet deep, concealed a treacherous, spongy floor of peat and marl. Rescue helicopters, hampered by the lack of solid ground, hovered over the site like dragonflies, their downwash whipping the sawgrass into a frantic, blinding frenzy. The noise was absolute, yet underneath the roar of rotors there was the suffocating silence of the marsh, a place that seemed to actively resent the intrusion of machinery. Rescuers who leapt from the skids found themselves chest-deep in a slurry of vegetation and rot, a substance that possessed a strange adhesive density, resisting every attempt to pull a boot free. This terrain defied standard recovery protocols. Because there was no dry land, the searchers were forced to create their own paths, trampling through the razor-edged grass that shredded clothing and skin alike. The heat of the day turned the water into a tepid, stagnant bath, while the darkness brought a chilling dampness that seeped into the marrow. The scale of the debris field was immense, scattered across a swath of the glades nearly 3 miles long. Pieces of the fuselage, personal effects, and remnants of life were swallowed by the vegetation almost instantly. Items that had been thrown clear were not merely lost. They were submerged in the dark, peaty substrate, hidden from view within minutes of the crash. What made the recovery particularly harrowing was the deceptive nature of the mud. To the eye, the surface appeared uniform, but underneath, the depth varied with capricious cruelty. A rescuer might step into 6 inches of water one moment and, with the next stride, sink waist-deep into a soft, anaerobic hole that offered no purchase. It was a landscape that functioned like a living trap, requiring the searchers to link arms and form human chains to navigate the bog without becoming casualties themselves. Every recovery team member moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, their progress measured in inches rather than yards. The air was thick with the heavy, sweet scent of disturbed mud and the metallic tang of jet fuel, a visceral reminder of the violence that had broken the tranquility of the sanctuary. Throughout the ordeal, the swamp held its secrets with a singular, quiet intensity, yielding the fallen only after the most exhaustive manual labor, as if the water itself were loath to relinquish the souls it had claimed in that singular, blind descent. The Florida Everglades is a paradox of visibility. In the heat of the day, it is a blinding expanse of light, where the sun reflects off the water to turn every blade of sawgrass into a sharp, white needle. But at night, the swamp becomes a void. It is a featureless, lightless expanse that pulls the sky down into the water, erasing the horizon until the world is nothing but a seamless, dark mirror. There are no landmarks to track, no elevations to gauge depth, and no lights to guide a path. It is a landscape that demands a human being to understand where they are. Yet it offers absolutely nothing in the way of visual evidence to help them figure it out. When you fly over the Everglades at night, you are not flying over land. You are flying over a black liquid shadow that seems to have no bottom and no end. It was into this absolute nothingness that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 descended on the night of December 29, 1972. The Lockheed L-1011 was a massive wide-body marvel of modern aviation, and it was on a routine approach to Miami. The cockpit crew, experienced and capable, became preoccupied with a minor mechanical failure. A single landing gear indicator light that had failed to illuminate, suggesting that the nose gear might not be locked. For several minutes, the pilots were entirely focused on that small, dim bulb, adjusting their instruments and troubleshooting the system. In the silence of the cockpit, the aircraft began a slow, steady, and entirely unnoticed drift toward the dark expanse below. The swamp did not rise up to meet them, it simply waited. Because the Everglades is so perfectly, terrifyingly flat, the pilots had no visual cue that they were descending. There were no trees to measure altitude against, no hills to warn them of the ground, no flickering lights of a city to provide a point of reference. They were flying into a void that looked, from their windows, exactly like the sky they had just left. They were looking at a darkness that had no depth, and they were, until the very last second, entirely unaware that the surface of the earth had climbed to meet their hull. When the aircraft struck the sawgrass and the mud of the Everglades at speed, the impact was catastrophic. Yet even in the violence of the crash, the swamp acted according to its own cruel nature. The muck and the shallow water, which make the Everglades so impossible to walk through, served as a shock absorber. It was a soft, deep grave. Had the flight landed on solid, dry earth, the wreckage would have been obliterated. Instead, the soft, yielding floor of the swamp allowed the fuselage to break apart in a way that permitted 75 people to survive the initial impact. But the swamp does not give back what it takes without exacting a toll. Those who survived the fall into that dark, trackless marsh found themselves in a landscape that was actively hostile to the injured. The water was cold and saturated with the bacteria of the deep muck. The darkness was total, broken only by the flickering fires of the wreckage. For the survivors, every movement was an ordeal. The same soft ground that had cushioned the crash now turned into a trap, clinging to their clothes and pulling at their limbs as they tried to find safety. The rescuers, when they finally arrived, had to wade through miles of that same suffocating, knee-deep black water, a process that turned the rescue into a slow, agonizing crawl. 101 people did not survive. The swamp, having caught them in the dark, held them fast in the mud and the sawgrass, making the recovery of remains a task that lasted for weeks. The NTSB investigation that followed became a cornerstone of modern aviation safety, forever changing how pilots are trained to monitor their descent and how they interact with their instruments. Yet for all the science and the engineering analysis, the central fact remained: the swamp had simply been too flat and too dark for the human eye to perceive. It is a sobering thought, for any who traverse that wilderness, that the most sophisticated technology on Earth could be defeated by the sheer, featureless emptiness of a marsh. It reminds us that our perception of the world is fragile, and that we rely on the landscape to tell us where we stand. When the landscape refuses to provide that information, when it stretches out before us as a flat, dark, identical expanse, we are lost, whether we are in the air or on the ground. The swamp killed 101 people that night by doing the one thing it does best: being so flat, so dark, so featureless that even a seasoned cockpit crew could fly straight into it and never see the ground come up. The same muck that killed them saved 75 others, and then bred fever in their wounds until rescuers could reach them across the black water. A swamp can take you out of the sky, and it can take you from the shore. But mostly it takes people who walk in on their own 2 feet, people like the young man who left a note and drove to the edge of the prairie to find his river, The search effort for Eppler became a masterclass in the futility of human order against the chaos of the glades. Helicopters buzzed the coastline, their downdraft flattening the sawgrass into frantic silver-green waves, yet the optics of the canopy and the dense interlocking shadows of the mangroves rendered the ground invisible from above. On the surface, ground crews navigated a terrain that defied standard movement. They waded through gator holes, submerged limestone depressions that plummet from knee-deep muck to chest-high water without warning, and navigated through thickets of black mangrove roots that grew like sharpened skeletal fingers reaching up from the peat. To walk here was to contend with a topography that was fundamentally liquid. Even the most seasoned park rangers acknowledged that the humidity turned the air into a thermal blanket, draining the sweat from a body until the salt crusted on the skin, leaving a person as dehydrated as the parched marl they walked upon. Every step was a negotiation with the muck, which possessed a viscous, suction-like quality, holding firm to boots and leggings until a hiker was forced to expend twice the energy just to advance a single yard. The silence of the region was equally tactical, a stifling heavy quiet that swallowed the sound of a shout within 50 feet, rendering the traditional auditory cues of a search entirely useless. As the days stretched into a week, the scale of the operation expanded to include K-9 units, though the scent trails died almost instantly in the saline mist and the unpredictable eddying of the coastal winds. The searchers moved with a grim, professional focus, yet they were effectively tracing the outline of a ghost, contending with a landscape that seemed to actively reconfigure itself to resist discovery. They were not looking for a man so much as they were attempting to navigate a vast, shifting puzzle box that refused to be solved. The coastal Prairie Trail begins at the very edge of Flamingo, where the paved road ends and the true, harsh nature of the Florida Everglades takes hold. It is not a trail in the sense of a high mountain path or a woodland walk. It is a long, flat, blistering track that cuts across a salt-blasted landscape of buttonwood scrub and open, sun-bleached earth. In the heat of a South Florida summer, the air here hangs heavy and still, pressing down on the marl soil until it cracks and turns to dust. To follow it is to walk directly into the mouth of the wilderness, moving away from the safety of the marina and toward the dark, tangled wall of the mangrove forest that guards the coastline. There is no shade to be found, no landmark to provide a sense of scale, and as the path winds toward the Gulf of Mexico, the ground itself begins to lose its integrity, softening into the saline muck that characterizes the transition between solid land and the infinite hungry marsh. It is a place of profound, unsettling emptiness, where the wind carries the scent of salt and stagnant water, and where the silence is so absolute that it feels like a weight. It is here that the Everglades does not simply hide a person, it waits for them, with a patience that has nothing to do with time. In the final days of July 1999, a 20-year-old man named Kyle Eppler arrived at this trailhead. He had driven for hours, crossing the flat, humid expanse of the Florida peninsula, carrying with him the intent to walk into the landscape that most people only view from the safety of a car window. He left behind a note that served as a brief, haunting testament to his arrival, a few sentences written down that indicated he had come to the Everglades to find his river and himself. It is a statement that has been recorded in the files of those who searched for him, a fragment of human purpose left behind in a world that is fundamentally indifferent to human searching. He left his vehicle at the trailhead, a silent locked shell containing his camping gear, his food, and his journals, as if he had decided that the equipment of his life was no longer necessary for the journey he intended to take. He stepped out of the car and onto the trail, leaving the comfort of the known world behind, and began the long, slow walk toward the mangrove edge. The search that followed was as thorough as the geography permitted, yet it was defined from the start by the impossible nature of the terrain. When it became clear that Kyle Eppler was not returning to his vehicle, authorities began to comb the coastal prairie and the maze of tidal creeks and dense, impenetrable roots that line the shore. They found the point where he had been, or rather, they found the last physical evidence of his presence. Farther down the trail, discarded on the dry, cracked earth, lay his shirt, It was a single, lonely item of clothing left in the middle of a vast, unforgiving expanse, and it became the final marker in the timeline of his disappearance. Beyond that point, the trail dissolved into the salt marsh and the mangroves, and the track simply stopped. There were no further signs, no footprints in the mud that hardened under the sun, and no path cut through the dense vegetation. The searchers moved through the sawgrass and the mangroves, navigating the same heat and the same disorientation that Kyle had faced, but the swamp revealed nothing. They searched for days, then weeks, calling out into the stillness, but the Everglades kept its silence. There is a specific kind of unease that settles over a case like this, one that is not born of a search for a culprit or a conspiracy, but from the simple, terrifying realization that the landscape itself is the barrier. When a person walks into a mountain range, there is a physical reality to the heights and the valleys, a topography that can be mapped and understood. But in the coastal prairie, the wilderness is fluid. The water table rises and falls with the tides. The vegetation is so thick that a searcher can walk past a person within a few feet and never know it. And the ground is a sponge that can swallow a body and move it with the slow, inevitable pressure of the shifting silt. To look at the coastal prairie is to look at a place that has been erasing its own history for thousands of years. It does not keep records, and it does not offer answers. It merely persists. Kyle Eppler was a young man with a destination in mind, a man who sought something specific from the water, and yet he was folded into the landscape so completely that he might never have existed at all. The search teams eventually pulled back. The equipment was packed away, and the coastal prairie trail returned to its state of quiet, sun-baked isolation. The car at the trailhead was eventually claimed. The items inside were catalogued, and the case was moved into the archives of the missing. There was no foul play, no sign of struggle, and no indication that he had ever intended to return. There was only the note, the shirt on the trail, and the massive, unblinking presence of the swamp. It is a story that lingers in the park records, not because it is a mystery in the traditional sense, but because it is a perfect example of how the Florida wilderness functions. It does not require a dramatic struggle or a sudden accident to claim a life. It only requires a person to step off the path and into the green. The tragedy of the coastal prairie is that it is so deceptive in its openness. From a distance, it looks like a place where a person could be seen for miles, a place where a search would be easy and effective. But once you are inside the sawgrass, the horizon vanishes. The sky becomes a narrow slit of light, and the ground beneath your feet becomes a trap. It is a place that invites you to lose your way and then makes it impossible to find it again. A car full of gear at the trailhead, a note about finding a river, and a shirt lying farther down an empty trail that is all the coastal prairie ever gave back of Kyle Eppler. The swamp took the rest, and the answer with it. And it was not the last young man to leave a full car at an Everglades trailhead and walk into the green on purpose. The next one drove all the way from Texas to do it. The searchers contended with a landscape that functioned less like Earth and more like a fluid shifting lung. To walk the perimeter of Pine Glades Lake was to participate in a rhythmic, treacherous labor. One moment the boot found a purchase of jagged, honeycombed limestone, and the next, the ground surrendered into a slurry of marl that surged over the ankle with the consistency of warm, wet concrete. This was the pinnacle of the Everglades' deceptive geography. A place where the elevation changes measured in fractions of an inch, but determined the difference between solid ground and a bottomless anaerobic trap. The vegetation, meanwhile, acted as a shroud. Stunted, gnarled cypress trees, some standing, some long dead and bleached to the color of bone, created a chaotic architecture of vertical lines that fractured the light and confused the depth perception of anyone trying to maintain a bearing. For the ground crews, the difficulty of the terrain was compounded by the oppressive sensory-stripping humidity of a Florida August. In such heat, the swamp breathes, exhaling a thick, sulfurous mist that clings to the skin and muddies the vision. The search teams were forced to move in a slow, agonizing crawl, beating back the razor-edged blades of sawgrass that grew in impenetrable, wall-like clusters. Every step required a conscious negotiation with the environment, a constant testing of the ground's structural integrity. Even so, the sheer scale of the operation was immense. The teams utilized thermal imaging cameras that were designed to pierce the heavy canopy, hoping to detect the distinct heat signature of a human body against the cool, shaded pockets of the swamp floor. They scanned the surface of the lake itself, knowing that if a person were to succumb to the exhaustion of the trek, they might simply slump into the dark water, their form instantly obscured by the thick, tannin-stained liquid that rendered the bottom invisible from a distance of only a few inches. Amidst the exhaustive grid searches, investigators uncovered personal effects that only deepened the ambiguity of his presence. A leather wallet remained in the vehicle, along with a set of keys and a map that appeared untouched, suggesting that he had not planned to venture far enough to require navigation. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic scribblings or indicators of distress left behind in the cab. It was a sterile, quiet vacancy. The investigators were left to grapple with the unnerving possibility that the man had not been fleeing anything at all, but had simply walked toward the horizon with the singular, quiet intent of a ghost, leaving behind a world of possessions for a landscape that demanded none. Pine Glades Lake sits within the northern reaches of Everglades National Park, a quiet, unassuming basin of water ringed by the skeletal, sun-bleached shapes of dwarf cypress and the encroaching shadow of pine flatwoods. It is not the most famous part of the park, nor is it the most forbidding. To an observer driving the loop road, it presents as a tranquil, almost pastoral stop, a place where the water reflects the sky with a mirror-like stillness, and where the transition from the solid pineland into the saturated, sawgrass-choked interior is so gradual that a traveler might not even notice they have crossed the threshold into the deep swamp. It is a place of heavy, humid silence, where the air feels as though it is waiting for a sound that never comes. The landscape here is deceptively thin. The ground is a porous limestone shelf covered in a shallow, deceptive layer of marl and muck that hides the true depth of the water beneath. In August of 2011, this stillness was broken not by a catastrophe of nature, but by the discovery of an abandoned vehicle, a green pickup truck that had sat in the parking area long enough to draw the attention of park rangers who grew concerned by its persistent, solitary presence in the heat of the Florida summer. The driver was identified as Jacob Olivier, a 23-year-old man from Texas. He had no known connections to South Florida, no family in the region, and no apparent reason to be at Pine Glades Lake. He was, to all intents and purposes, a man who had simply appeared in the middle of a vast, unforgiving wilderness, with no trail to explain his arrival and no itinerary to explain his intent. When the park authorities began their investigation, they found the truck locked and the interior largely as one might expect of a traveler, save for the presence of an empty pistol case and a box of ammunition, details that would later be scrutinized, though they provided no clear narrative of what had transpired. What they did not find, however, was any indication of where he had gone. The truck was a static, silent monument in a landscape that was anything but, and the moment the investigators opened the doors to begin their search, they were confronted with the most unsettling reality of the swamp, the complete absence of a path. The search for Jacob Olivier was not a small or local affair. It grew into a concentrated multi-agency operation that involved 45 searchers, 2 helicopters, and 3 specialized K9 units trained to detect human scent in the most difficult of terrain. The teams fanned out from the parking area, moving through the cypress stands and the thick serrated blades of the sawgrass, their movements slowed by the reality of the ground. In a forest, a searcher can look for broken branches or disturbed leaves. On a mountain, they can look for a slide or a boot print in the dirt. But in the environment of Pine Glades Lake, the ground is an active participant in the disappearance. If a person walks through the wet marl, the ground swells and closes. If they step into the water, the silt shifts to swallow the impression of the boot. The searchers moved in a grid, pressing through the heat, hoping for the one sign that would turn a recovery into a rescue. They searched the perimeter of the lake, they scoured the nearby pinelands, and they pushed into the deeper, wetter sectors of the Slough that extended beyond the reach of the casual visitor. The failure of that search was not for lack of effort or technology. It was rather a result of the specific, maddening nature of the swamp's geography. The K9 units, which were the most critical element of the search, provided a discovery that was more haunting than a total lack of evidence. The dogs were able to pick up the scent of the man at the door of his truck, and they tracked it to a point just a few yards from the vehicle where the scent simply vanished. It did not lead toward the water, it did not lead toward the thicket, and it did not lead along the road. It ceased to exist. To the searchers, it was as if Jacob Olivier had stepped out of his truck, walked a handful of paces into the open air of the Florida wilderness, and dissolved. There was no struggle, no discarded gear, no sign of a wrong turn, and no physical evidence that he had moved in any specific direction. The swamp had intercepted his trajectory and erased it, leaving behind only the truck and the questions that would follow it for years. In the days that followed, the searchers continued to comb the area, their frustration mounting as the reality of the terrain became clear. They were looking for a man in a place that effectively possesses no memory of those who pass through it. The water and the muck work in concert to reclaim whatever enters them, and the density of the vegetation ensures that a body or even a significant trace of a person can remain hidden just a few feet from a trail, obscured by the very plants that thrive in the nutrient-rich drowned environment. By the time the search was called off, it was clear that the swamp had claimed more than just a man. It had claimed the truth of his final moments. The silence of Pine Glades Lake returned, the green pickup was removed, and the mystery of the Texan who vanished into the Florida heat became another entry in the long, grim ledger of the Everglades. The dogs found Jacob Olivier's scent at the door of his truck and nowhere else. No trail, no direction, no track leading into the green, as if the swamp had taken not just the man, but the very line of his footsteps. A stranger to Florida, gone at a lake he had no reason to visit. The next man had a reason. He drove to the Everglades to disappear on purpose, and the water gave him exactly that. If you look at a map of the Florida Everglades, the southern coast appears as a solid, unbroken line. But on the ground, that line dissolves into a chaotic, shifting architecture of saltwater and mud. This is the realm of the mangrove wilderness, a vast, tidal labyrinth of interconnected bays and narrow, suffocating channels that sprawl from the Shark River Slough to the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. At the center of this maze sits Whitewater Bay. It is a place that defies the logic of geography, where every turn in the brackish water looks identical to the one before it, where the tides push the very earth beneath you, and where the mangroves grow so thick and so high that they form a green, impenetrable wall. It is a wilderness of isolation so profound that it becomes a physical weight. It is not just a place where you can get lost. It is a place where you can be effectively erased from the surface of the world, hidden by a canopy that never breaks and water that never clears. In December of 2007, a man named Andrew Renton left his home in the north with a canoe strapped to his vehicle and a destination in mind that few would ever choose for a return journey. He had been suffering from personal illness and had made his intentions clear in a final note mailed to his family, expressing his desire to disappear into the quiet of the wilderness. He traveled south, straight into the heart of the Everglades, and arrived at the boat ramps that serve as the only gates into the vast mangrove network. He launched his canoe into the dark, silent water of the western Everglades, disappearing into the complex web of creeks and hidden bays that characterize the Whitewater Bay region. The search that followed was a grim testament to the nature of this particular landscape. When a person vanishes in the deep mangrove wilderness, the scale of the task is almost impossible to comprehend. There are thousands of miles of tidal channels, many of them barely wide enough for a small boat, all obscured by the dense, tangled roots of the red mangroves and the shifting patterns of the tide. The ground is not land in any sense that a person can traverse. It is a soft, deep, anaerobic mud that swallows whatever enters it. Searchers spent days and then weeks quartering the maze, pushing boats into corridors where the light barely penetrates, and the silence is absolute. They located his vehicle at the launch point, and they eventually recovered the canoe, but they found nothing else. There was no sign of him in the mud, no trace on the banks, and no indication that he had ever left the water. Andrew Renton had chosen a place that does not merely hide, it consumes. The tidal environment of the western Everglades is a machine of constant, slow-motion movement. The currents shift the sediment, the mangroves grow over the water, and the very structure of the channels changes with the seasons and the storms. To go into that swamp with the intention of never returning is to trust the swamp to fulfill that wish with absolute efficiency. And it did. The Everglades did not betray the silence he sought. It kept him. His family was left with the evidence of his departure, the truck, the canoe, the note, but they were denied the finality of a recovery. There was no grave to visit, no place to mark where his journey had ended, only the vast, indifferent expanse of the mangrove forest. There is a cold, clinical permanence to a disappearance in a place like Whitewater Bay. It forces those who remain to confront the reality that some landscapes are simply not designed for human presence, and that they possess a capacity for secrecy that is indifferent to human grief. The swamp does not care for the reasons why a person enters its borders. It does not judge the intent or the state of mind of the traveler. It simply receives them, closes the canopy over their path, and allows the natural cycle of the water and the tide to reclaim whatever is left behind. It is the ultimate vanishing, a quiet, total surrender to a geography that does not record human existence. This is the central, unsettling truth of the deep Everglades. It is a wilderness that can be used as a final destination because it is so effectively empty of humanity. It is a place where the barrier between the living world and the void is razor thin, and where a person can step off the map with the certainty that they will not be found. But there are other swamps in the American landscape that do not wait for a person to walk into them. Some are traps that wait for a crowd, places where the swamp and the tragedy arrive at the same moment, leaving a scar on the water that remains for generations. Long before the modern era, on a winter night in 1869, a different swamp did its killing all at once, by fire, on the black water of a Cypress lake. The search for the victims began almost before the embers of the Mittie Stevens had dimmed, yet the rescue parties found themselves paralyzed by the very geography that had claimed the passengers. The lake bottom was not a stable shelf of sand or clay, but a treacherous, shifting slurry of decades-old river silt and decaying vegetable matter. This muck possessed a viscous, clinging quality that made the recovery efforts a grueling, grotesque chore. Divers, or rather, the men who waded into the debris with poles and hooks, described the floor as a living floor that trembled and gave way underfoot, creating treacherous pockets of suction. The water was so thick with tannic acid and suspended peat that vision vanished at the fingertips. Even in broad daylight, a searcher could not see his own boots. They were forced to navigate by touch, feeling through the dense, tangled lattice of submerged cypress knees and the jagged, splintered ribs of the wreck, which lay partially submerged like the bones of some prehistoric leviathan. There were accounts from the recovery crews of objects that surfaced days after the fire: a gentleman's watch, a sodden ledger, a silk ribbon, rising to the top as if ejected by the lake's own slow digestive heave. Yet the human remains proved far more elusive. The heavy iron side wheels, which had acted as a threshing machine during the final frantic minutes of the disaster, had pinned many victims beneath the hull. The weight of the timber and the crushing force of the wheel had forced these bodies deep into the anaerobic ooze, where the lack of oxygen prevented the typical bloating that might have brought them back to the surface. The reputations of the surrounding bayous grew grim in the months that followed. Locals who navigated those particular channels spoke of the Caddo breath, pockets of swamp gas released by the churning of the wreck that smelled faintly of scorched pine and something far more copper-heavy and metallic. The scale of the disappearance left a vacuum in the local consciousness. 61 souls had simply ceased to be, their physical presence retracted into the darkness, as if the lake had never permitted them to stand on its surface at all. It was an erasure of industrial proportions, executed with the cold, unhurried efficiency of the mud, leaving the families of the lost to mourn over a vast, liquid expanse that offered nothing back but the same indifferent reflection of the sky. Caddo Lake sits on the border of Texas and Louisiana, a place that defies the traditional definition of a lake. It is a labyrinth of bald cypress, their knees knuckling up through the tea-colored water, their branches draped in long funereal curtains of Spanish moss that catch the light and hold it in a perpetual, filtered gloom. In the middle of the 19th century, this was not a place of quiet reflection or tourist excursions. It was a vital, treacherous artery of commerce. Steamboats of the era were the heavy lifters of the South, pushing through the tangled cypress channels to carry cotton and passengers from the river systems of Louisiana into the heart of Texas. Caddo Lake was a shallow, snag-filled and claustrophobic passage where the depth could change by inches and where a pilot had to navigate by the rhythm of the trees rather than the clarity of the water. It was a swamp in the form of a lake, and like all swamps, it demanded a respect that the engines of the industrial age were often too arrogant to pay. On the night of February 12, 1869, the sidewheeler Mittie Stevens was making its way across these dark, moss-choked waters. She was a vessel of the era, built of wood and powered by steam, carrying at least 107 souls, a mix of crew, travelers, and cargo. The night was cold and, as was the practice for navigation in such dense, unlit water, the ship carried iron baskets on her bow, filled with burning pine knots or resin to cast a flickering, hellish light across the cypress trunks and the black water ahead. It was a common enough sight, but it was also a design for disaster. The boat was packed with bales of cotton and hay near the bow, placed dangerously close to the exposed flames of the navigation torches. The fire began as a spark, then a lick of flame, and finally a roaring furnace that consumed the forward deck in seconds. The Mittie Stevens was not in the middle of a vast, open sea. She was in a shallow, congested basin, barely minutes away from the safety of the dock at Swanson's Landing. The captain attempted to bring the burning vessel to the shore, but the fire had already severed the means of control. In the panic that followed, the passengers and crew faced an impossible choice: remain on a deck that was rapidly turning into a pyre, or jump into the black, shallow water surrounding them. What happened next serves as a haunting testament to the lethal mechanics of a swamp. The water in that part of Caddo Lake was only about 3 feet deep. In any other setting, this would have been a survivable ordeal, a frantic swim to the muddy bank. But the Mittie Stevens was still under a degree of momentum, and, as the chaos unfolded, the boat continued to churn through the water, her massive iron-shod side wheels still turning. The people who leaped from the burning bow found themselves in the path of the vessel's own machinery. As they struggled in the mud and the reeds, the paddle wheels caught them, striking them down or dragging them into the silt-heavy water, pinning them beneath the hull or simply crushing the life from them in the very shallow, murky depths they had hoped would be their salvation. The aftermath was a scene of industrial horror in a natural setting that seemed designed to hide the scale of the loss. Of the 107 or more people aboard, 61 died. They did not perish from the vastness of an ocean or the depth of a canyon. They died within sight of the shore, in 3 feet of water, in a place where the swamp floor was so soft and so eager to reclaim what fell into it that many of the bodies were never recovered. The dark, sediment-rich water of Caddo Lake, filled with the debris of the wreck and the shifting silt of the basin, simply closed over the dead. They were absorbed into the bottom of the lake, claimed by the roots of the cypress and the quiet, unending accumulation of time. The Mittie Stevens sat there for years, a charred skeleton of timber slowly sinking into the muck, while the swamp continued its patient, silent work of erasing the traces of the disaster. To stand on the banks of Caddo Lake today is to look out over a mirror that hides more than it reflects. The water remains dark, opaque with tannins, and the cypress trees stand like sentinels that have watched the water rise and fall for centuries. It is a place that feels as though it is constantly settling, constantly shifting, holding its secrets beneath the surface of a liquid forest. The loss of the Mittie Stevens is remembered in local history, but the physical reality of that night, the way the lake took 61 people in a matter of minutes and refused to relinquish the majority of them, is a reminder of the swamp's singular, terrifying appetite. It does not require a deep abyss to swallow a life. It only requires a surface that looks like water and a bottom that acts like a grave. The tragedy of the Mittie Stevens was a singular event, a concentrated horror that unfolded in the dark of a 19th century night. But the swamp has the capacity for even larger, more sudden erasures. There is a specific kind of violence inherent in a place that offers no resistance, a place where a falling object or a drowning person can disappear without a ripple. When something massive and fast meets a surface that is soft and unyielding, the results are catastrophic. The swamp does not care for the scale of the disaster. It only knows how to receive what is given to it, and there is no record of the swamp ever being full. 61 people died in 3 feet of water on Caddo Lake, close enough to a Cypress shore to see it, and killed anyway, by fire and by the wheels of their own burning boat, in a swamp so shallow you could stand in it. The Blackwater took most of them and never gave them back. More than a century later, another swamp swallowed even more, even faster, a jetliner and everyone aboard, gone into the sawgrass in seconds. The recovery effort defied the conventional logic of crash site investigations. In most tragedies, the wreckage remains anchored to the earth, a jagged testament to the velocity of the fall. Here, the earth itself was a liquid deception. The impact site, officially designated as a deep muck environment, did not merely hold the debris. It actively worked to digest it. Rescuers found themselves performing a task that hovered between forensic science and deep-sea salvage. They waded through a slurry of peat and sawgrass that felt less like terrain and more like a viscous living lung, shifting and heaving with every step. The limestone shelf beneath the surface was uneven, pockmarked with sinkholes that could swallow a man whole, forcing the crews to tether themselves to ropes just to maintain their footing in the waist-deep, fuel-slicked water. The scale of the destruction was absolute, yet the swamp granted no perspective. Investigators often found themselves standing within feet of the primary impact zone, yet they could see nothing but the same impenetrable wall of serrated blades that had been standing there for decades. The heat was a physical weight, baking the toxic cocktail of jet kerosene and decomposing organic matter into a vapor that clung to the skin and burned the lungs. Searchers reported that the environment seemed to actively resist their presence. Every time they cleared a patch of mud, the rising water table and the restless, shifting peat would slide back into the hole, erasing their progress by the next sunrise. Amidst the fractured aluminum and the shredded flight manuals, there were artifacts that spoke to the suddenness of the transition: a child's shoe, a pristine photograph, a single earring, all resting in a place where no human object had any business existing. The forensic teams worked with long-handled rakes and specialized strainers, sifting through the black ooze for hours at a time, often finding that the swamp had already dismantled the evidence of human form. It was a landscape that demanded a terrifying intimacy with the missing, requiring investigators to reach deep into the soft, anaerobic throat of the Everglades, hoping to retrieve a scrap of identity from the hungry, indifferent silt. If you fly over the southern tip of the Florida peninsula, you will see a landscape that looks like a calm emerald sea. From the air, the Shark River Slough appears as a vast, seamless expanse of sawgrass, a slow-moving river of water and earth that stretches toward the horizon until the sky and the land become indistinguishable. It is the heart of the Everglades, the deep, wet center that feeds the entire southern reach of the state. To the eye, it is flat and serene, a place where the water is thin and the grass is dense, creating a mosaic of green that seems to go on forever. But this is not a river in the way we understand the word. It is a shallow, sluggish flow, a sheet of water barely a few feet deep that rests upon a bedrock of limestone, covered by a deep, thick layer of soft, hungry muck. It is a place of absolute, deceptive stillness. In the Shark River Slough, the ground is not solid and the water is not clear. It is a place that acts like a lung, breathing in the heat and the moisture. And it is here, in this vast, watery wilderness, that the Everglades exerts its most profound, terrifying power. The power to take a thing, no matter how large, and pull it down into the depths until it is part of the sediment itself. On the afternoon of May 11th, 1996, the Shark River Slough became the site of a tragedy that remains the most visceral, haunting example of the swamp's appetite. ValuJet Flight 592, a Douglas DC-9, departed from Miami International Airport carrying 110 people. Shortly after takeoff, a fire sparked in the cargo hold, ignited by improperly stored chemical oxygen generators. Within minutes, the aircraft was forced into a terminal descent. It did not crash into a forest or a mountain or a city. It plunged into the deep, trackless sawgrass of the Slough. The plane descended at a near vertical angle, striking the soft, saturated ground of the Everglades with such force that it effectively disintegrated upon impact. The impact did not leave a crater in the way a mountain might, nor did it leave scattered wreckage that a rescue team could easily navigate. Instead, the aircraft and everyone aboard it were swallowed by the muck. The swamp, with its deep layer of peat and waterlogged vegetation, acted as a shroud. The plane, the luggage, and the 110 souls on board were pulled into the dark, churning slurry of the Slough, buried instantly beneath the surface of the green. The recovery effort that followed was not a search in the traditional sense. It was an excavation of a nightmare. For weeks, responders and investigators waded into the waist-deep toxic water, moving through a landscape that had been churned into a gray, unrecognizable soup of mud, jet fuel, tangled sawgrass, and human remains. The environment was hostile in every way. The heat was relentless. The water was filled with the jagged remains of the wreckage, and the local wildlife, the alligators and the snakes that called the Slough home, remained indifferent to the scene. The recovery crews worked with a grim, methodical precision, using specialized equipment to sift through the mud, looking for anything that could be identified. But the swamp had claimed its prize. The soft, deep, anaerobic nature of the muck meant that the remains of those on board were not just lost. They were reclaimed by the ecosystem. When the operation finally concluded, the numbers were a testament to the swamp's absolute efficiency. Of the 110 people who had been on that flight, only partial remains of roughly 68 to 70 individuals were ever recovered and identified. The rest, the vast majority of the souls aboard that flight, were simply gone, dissolved into the mud and the peat of the Slough, buried beneath the roots of the sawgrass. There was no gravesite to visit, no final resting place for the families to gather around, and no way to retrieve what the swamp had taken. The Everglades had closed over them, and in doing so, it had erased their presence from the world as cleanly as if they had never existed. It was not a matter of a search failing to find a person. It was a matter of the environment itself ensuring that there was nothing left to find. The tragedy of Flight 592 serves as a grim, undeniable reminder of what the Everglades is capable of. We like to think that we can mark a site of disaster, that we can memorialize a place and control the narrative of what happened there. But the Shark River Slough shows us that the wilderness does not care for our memorials. It is an indifferent living force that consumes what it is given. The mud and the water do not discriminate between a single person who wandered too far off a trail and 100 people who fell from the sky. The outcome is the same. The swamp takes, it hides, and it keeps. It turns everything it touches into the same dark, soft, uniform floor of the marsh. To walk near the edge of the Shark River Slough today is to feel the weight of that silence. It is a place that looks beautiful and peaceful, a place where the sunlight reflects off the water and the birds circle overhead in the quiet, humid air. But beneath that beauty lies the memory of what was taken. The Slough is a reminder that in this country there is no such thing as being truly safe because the ground itself is not to be trusted. We see the sawgrass and the thin water and we assume we know what we are looking at, but we are looking at a shroud. We are looking at a place that has been consuming human lives for as long as people have dared to cross it. 110 people went into the Shark River Slough at once, and the Everglades swallowed them so completely that only partial remains of about 70 were ever found. For the rest of the families, the swamp kept everything, even a body to bury. That is what this wetland does, whether it takes 100 at a time or one. And the last name on this list is one. A single man the swamp took so entirely that when they finally found him, no one on earth could say who he was. There is a wetland in South Florida, just to the north and west of the Everglades, called Big Cypress. It is not the sawgrass river of the Everglades proper. It is a flooded prairie of dwarf cypress, stunted wide-spaced trees standing in a few inches of dark water that stretches, flat and shining and nearly identical, to every horizon. The Florida Trail runs through it, a thin line of higher ground and marked posts threading across country that is otherwise trackless in the truest sense. Mile after mile of the same shallow water and the same small trees, a place so empty of landmark and so hard to enter or leave that a person can walk its interior for days and meet no one at all. It is by any honest measure one of the loneliest walkable places in the eastern United States. And it is where this film ends. Because of all the swamps on this list, Big Cypress took a person the most completely. Not by hiding his body in the end, but by keeping something the others never even touched. In July of 2018, two hikers deep in the preserve came upon a small yellow tent pitched at a remote spot called Noble's Camp, far out along the trail. Inside the tent was the body of a man. He had died of starvation. He weighed at the end only about 83 pounds, and there was nothing with him. No wallet, no phone, no identification of any kind, nothing at all to say who he was. A man had walked into the middle of one of the emptiest places in Florida and lain down in a tent and died of hunger, and left behind not a single object that carried his name. At first that seemed like a solvable problem. It is very hard in the modern United States to be no one. We are a fingerprinted, photographed, data-based, DNA-sampled people. The machinery for identifying an unknown body is vast and practiced. So the authorities did what that machinery does. They took his fingerprints and ran them and got nothing. They took his DNA and ran it against the databases and got nothing. They released a description and then a photograph and then a facial reconstruction. And the case caught the public imagination the way few unidentified remains cases ever do. He had, it emerged, hiked long stretches of the eastern trails in the months and years before. And other hikers remembered him, remembered a quiet private man who had gone by trail names, first Denim, and later the one that would become famous, mostly Harmless. And still no one could say who he was. This is the part that made the case one of the strangest of its decade, and the reason it belongs at the #1 spot on a list about the swamps that never give people back. Because mostly Harmless had not died anonymous in the way of a person with no connections. He had walked hundreds of miles of populated country. He had passed through towns, resupplied at stores, spoken with dozens of fellow hikers who liked him and remembered his face and his manner and his trail names. He had a life somewhere behind him, a family, a history, an ordinary paper trail of a human existence, and none of it connected. For 2.5 years, with his photograph on national news and websites devoted to the case, and thousands upon thousands of tips pouring in, not one person on earth could look at the face of the man who died in the yellow tent and say, "I know him. That is his name." Think about how strange that is. The swamp had killed him. The isolation and the hunger of Big Cypress had ended his life as surely as the black water ended anyone else's on this list. But the swamp was almost the smaller of the two vanishings. The larger one had happened before he ever reached Florida. Somewhere at some point this man had come so completely loose from the world, from his family, his name, the web of people who are supposed to notice when a person is gone, that he could die in a tent in a national preserve, with his picture on every screen in the country, and remain, for years, no one. The wilderness took his body. The world had already let go of his name. It ended at last, the way so many of these cases now end. In December of 2020, more than 2 years after the two hikers found the tent, advanced DNA genealogy, the same kind of forensic detective work that has cracked so many cold cases in recent years, finally traced the genetic threads back to a family and gave the man in the yellow tent his name. He was Vance John Rodriguez from Louisiana. There was no foul play. No one had harmed him. For reasons that were his own, he had walked away from his life and out onto the long trails and kept walking under a borrowed name until the emptiness of Big Cypress and his own failing body brought him to a stop at Noble's Camp. I am going to leave the rest of it there, deliberately, Because after his identification, difficult things emerged about the life Vance Rodriguez had lived and the relationships he had left behind. And it is not the job of this film to sit in judgment of a dead and troubled man, or to turn the hardest parts of a real person's private history into entertainment. He was, it turned out, a complicated and wounded human being, as a great many people are. The strangeness of the case was never really about who he had been. It was about the thing this whole film has been circling: how completely a person can disappear, not just their body into a swamp, but their entire self out of the world, so that even after the wild gives the body up, the disappearance is not over, because there is no longer anyone who can say who was lost. That is why mostly Harmless is the last name on this list, and the truest of them. Every other person here was taken by the water, and in most cases kept by it. A man off a boat, a child off a boardwalk, 110 people out of the sky, a young man into a mangrove maze he chose because it would never give him back. The swamps swallowed their bodies, but Big Cypress did something stranger and sadder and more complete. It took a man whose name the world had already lost, and it held him in a yellow tent, in a flooded prairie, under trees no taller than a person, as a question the whole country tried for 2.5 years to answer, and it was never, in the way that mattered, the question of where. It was the question of who. 10 swamps. 10 people the Blackwater took and did not give back. A man in 20 minutes of sawgrass, a boater under the Atchafalaya, a child off a Louisiana boardwalk, 101 out of the sky and 110 more, 61 on a burning lake, and the lost young men who walked into the green on purpose. We think of the wild as a place that swallows the body and leaves us at least the grief of knowing who is gone. The swamp is worse than that. It is patient, and it is flat, and it is drowned. And now and then it takes a person so entirely, body and name and all the threads that tied them to the living, that the world simply closes over them, like still black water, and does not mark the spot. They found his body in a yellow tent in the flooded prairie of Big Cypress, and it still took 2.5 years, and the full weight of modern science, to answer the only question that mattered, not where he was, but who. Vance Rodriguez had come so loose from the world that the swamp taking his life was almost the smaller vanishing. 10 swamps. 10 people the Blackwater took and did not give back, and one it kept so completely that for years it kept even his name. We think of the wild as a place that swallows the body. The swamp is worse than that. It is patient, and it is flat, and it is drowned, and now and then it takes a person so entirely that the world closes over them like still water and does not mark the spot.